Jackson Warfield's Game Room.
Pandemic took the world by storm in 2008. So no, not talking about that pandemic or that other pandemic. I'm talking about Pandemic, the board game. A cooperative board game that came out in 2008, and the world that it took by storm is the board game world. Now, since then, number of different versions, iterations, expansions have been created of Pandemic, and today's list is the top 10. So starting with number 10, Pandemic 2nd Edition. You may be wondering, did I put this on the top list just so I can explain how the game works for the few people watching this that haven't actually played it? The answer is yes, well, kind of, but I'm just going to run with this. So, Pandemic is a cooperative game where you and a few of your friends, or people that you thought were your friends, are going to try and prevent a pandemic from getting out of control. It has a map similar to some dudes on a map type game, so it has that feel to it. It can be played solo as well, but that's the basic gist of it. Everyone takes on a different role, and you use cards to do things in the game and ultimately cure diseases. First edition was a nice production, had nice little wooden cubes and things like that. Pandemic 2nd Edition, though, took things to a new level with plastic cubes. Pandemic 2nd Edition is the kind you'll see in stores. In fact, I probably have like extra sealed copies if I really needed to. I mean, sometimes you'll see them for only a few bucks, but it's Pandemic 2nd Edition that spawned off all the different expansions that we know and love. It is the real version of Pandemic. Not a lot of people even realize that it is the 2nd edition of the game. My first time playing Pandemic was the 1st edition of the game, and I don't know why. I didn't really enjoy it as much. 2nd edition, number 10, implementations of Pandemic. Number 9, Pandemic Hot Zone, North America. Now this is as opposed to Pandemic Hot Zone Europe. Pandemic Hot Zone North America gets the nod because it came out first. I played it first. And a little bias towards North America, because that's where I live. Pandemic Hot Zone is the short version, the appetizery, the more digestible version of Pandemic. This is the version for people that are like really tired at the end of the day, but still want to get a game in. Pandemic Hot Zone does a great job of getting the same feel of Pandemic, but legitimately shortening the playtime. Reduces the number of infection cards you're dealing with, reduces the number of potential roles you could pick, reduces the number of cities on the board, and it really does a good job of still capturing Pandemic. It's honestly the kind of game you did not see up until a few years ago when board game design reached a new level of proficiency. If you like Pandemic, but you have trouble with the 1 to 2 hour gameplay time, especially maybe with some of the players you play with, or maybe you're like me and you have young kids or something else that's getting in the way of your normal big game nights, Pandemic Hot Zone is the way to go. Number 8, Forbidden Island. Now I know what you're thinking. Forbidden Island, that's not Pandemic. Oh, Pandemic system games are now a thing. Pandemic, here's what I think happened. Pandemic, after a while, started coming out with new editions, especially in the international series or based on the locations where the different board game festivals were taking place. They began stretching what counted as a Pandemic game. Started with Pandemic Iberia, also had Pandemic Cthulhu edition. You had Pandemic Fall of Rome, Pandemic Rising Tide. Eventually figured out that these aren't really Pandemic games, so you want to just call them the Pandemic system. Forbidden Island was the Pandemic Hot Zone of its era, before the Pandemic system was a thing. Matt Leacock went off and made his own Pandemic-like game that was a little bit faster than Pandemic. You could argue it's even better than Pandemic Hot Zone because it does add a little bit of variety. Where Pandemic Hot Zone is basically Pandemic just cramped into a tighter package. Forbidden Island is like Pandemic, but cramped, but a little bit of it squeezed out, and it looks a little bit of a different shape now. But it still gets the basic idea. You are, instead of dealing with disease and trying to control a pandemic, you're trying to basically get water off an island so it doesn't sink. It works. Also has some fun features of Forbidden Island. I keep calling it Pandemic Island. It's Forbidden Island. The Cliffs of Abandon, I used to call it the Cliffs of Abaddon before I even knew that 40K was the thing. You roll with that headcanon, it'll change the tenor of your games a little bit. And Forbidden Island was a great enough game in its own right that it spawned off its own series of games. First you had Forbidden Island. Then you had Forbidden Desert, Forbidden Sky, Forbidden Stars, Forbidden Light. I'm sure there's a soap opera in there too. Forbidden Island was really popular. So that's why it's number 8. Even though it doesn't have Pandemic in the name, it's Pandemic in the game. Number 7, Pandemic the Cure. Pandemic the Cure is basically Pandemic the dice game. Apparently there's a rule from about, 2017 to 2019 that if you had released the game, you also had to release the dice game to go with it. Castles of Burgundy, the dice game. You had Roll Through the Ages, Roll for the Galaxy. You had, I think if you bought a car, you're like a Chevy Suburban, the dice game. If you don't really want the car, you don't want the whole thing, just roll dice and see if you make it to your destination. All kind of based on Yahtzee. But Pandemic the Cure does a good job of taking Pandemic and making it a dice game. Still a cooperative game, a little more randomness to it, like you would hope for in a dice game, I guess. It doesn't have a map anymore. It has what looks kind of like a map, kind of works like a map, which is different. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit different, it works. Honestly, if you like Pandemic, but you're kind of tired of winning all the time, but you want something that you can say still, if you do a good job with, win with maybe 80% reliability, Pandemic the Cure is a game for you. It also spawned off its own expansion, which is not on the list, so I'll mention it here. Pandemic the Cure Experimental Meds. You want even more chunky dice to kind of throw. If dealing with disease wasn't enough, you instead need to pass around something that people are coughing on, Pandemic the Dice game, Pandemic the Cure is the way for you. Number 6, Pandemic Legacy Season 2. Of the Pandemic Legacy games, Season 2 is the weakest. It's still a very good game. It's really tough to evaluate how good it is because of that. The bar is just set so high with Pandemic and Pandemic Legacy that people have mostly negative, I have mostly negative memories of it, but if I try to take a step back and be objective, it's a great game. Now, mechanically what it is this is no spoilers here. Hold on. We got a baby monitor alert.
A few moments later.
Pandemic Legacy Season 2 plays kind of like Reverse Pandemic, where instead of trying to use the mechanisms of a game to keep things under control, you're kind of trying to spread things. So you're trying to almost encourage. It's not disease, though. It kind of takes Pandemic mechanisms and flips on its head. It makes it almost like an exploration game. But hold on.
12 seconds later.
Pulling in the big guns here. Problem with a Pandemic game as an exploration game is all you really end up doing is discovering new areas and infecting them. Shut Up and Sit Down actually did a good job of demonstrating this. It feels a little bit weird when you're exploring the world and then bring them into your network of disease, but hey, it's a good game. I definitely recommend it if you are gonna play all of the Pandemic Legacy games. Don't just skip Season 2. But if you're gonna pick just one to go with, it's not the one. Number 5, Pandemic on the Brink. Some people have said that Pandemic on the Brink may have been the greatest expansion for a board game ever made. I don't agree with being the best, but it's up there. It's a good one. Pandemic on the Brink brings 3 modules to Pandemic. The first one, Virulent Strain. One of the diseases you're dealing with will become more difficult to eradicate or to cure. For someone that's played Pandemic a lot, it's a welcome addition, that extra challenge. The second module is the beginning of the mutation challenge, which is the 5th disease, Purple Cubes. Can't argue with dropping in purple cubes in the game. I mean, well, it's a great color. You got the glass cubes. All right.
6.5 hours later.
Okay. All right, we're back. That was like a half hour or so of childcare. That's my life. Where were we? Pandemic on the Brink. The third module that they actually brought in was the Bioterrorist module. And this was an interesting solution to one of the biggest problems facing Pandemic and cooperative games in general, which is the quarterbacking problem. If you're not familiar, the quarterbacking problem is when you have a cooperative game and one person on the team knows the game or the system or whatever it is so well to do the best move you can come up with this team. All you have to do is ask the quarterback. People don't like that. That's not that fun. The way the Bioterrorist module flips that is what you're supposed to do is say, all right, Mr. Know-It-All, you're going to be the bioterrorist. You're actually going to be trying to plant disease around the world. We're going to work together. We're going to stop you. It's a great expansion. Number 5 for Pandemic implementations. Number 4, Pandemic in the Lab. So this was the next expansion to Pandemic. And honestly, the main drawback to Pandemic in the Lab is the fact that it's an expansion of an expansion. You need both base Pandemic and Pandemic on the Brink to play it fully. It adds on to the mutated strain, but what it really does is, that's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Is it takes the curing system for curing diseases and just makes it more thematic. Normal Pandemic, when you want to cure a disease, you have to trade in a set of 5 cards. You have a hand limit. Very often you have to choose between discarding the card that might win you the game later versus discarding the card that will help you immediately, definitely right now, and make sure you're still playing the game later. It's not always that fun of a decision to make, but what Pandemic in the Lab does is it takes that 5-card set and breaks it into a series of mechanisms where you go to research centers on the board and you have to process samples to get to the point where you cure the disease. It's more thematic. It also comes with Petri dishes, which is a very nice touch. I have it as the number 1 Pandemic expansion. Number 3, Pandemic Legacy Season 0. Pandemic Legacy Season 0 is the last implementation of Pandemic Legacy. Well, last as of this recording. I'm assuming they're not going to do another one. They might. Who knows? Pandemic Legacy Season 0 is the end of the Pandemic Legacy trilogy, and it works in pretty much everything Pandemic designers have learned since Pandemic Season 1 and all the other Pandemic games were released years ago. Thematically, you are in the midst of the Cold War. It's a prequel to Pandemic Legacy, which takes place more so in modern times. It's mechanically it's great. The downside of Pandemic Legacy Season 0, one, it's not really diseases anymore. Your diseases are like Russians. In some ways, honestly, it loses a little bit of the charm. Now, this might just be because the game was released in 2022. The game was released much more recently than Pandemic Legacy Season 1. Played a bunch of other Legacy games since then. Could be just the timing when it was released wasn't as great. But also, when you get a certain amount of mechanisms fine-tuned, you don't have that risk, that fear. When you have a game that's a little bit loosely designed, sometimes there's that fear of God thing where you're all right, there's a chance that we could lose so badly that we're just stuck forever. But a more polished game gives you ways out, kind of like a catch-up mechanism in Mario Kart, where you don't quite have that same fear in the first lap of Mario Kart as you do in the first lap of a real racing simulator. And that's where I think the drawback is. It's almost too much guarantees that your story is actually still going to make sense in the end. So your decisions, ironically, are not as impactful. That aside, it's a baller game. It's awesome. It is my second favorite Legacy game ever made after Pandemic Legacy Season 1, which is going to come in one of these remaining 2 spots. But not number 2, because number 2 is Pandemic Iberia. This is my favorite of the Pandemic system implementations, even though this predates the Pandemic system. Pandemic Iberia is pretty much just Pandemic, but in the Iberian Peninsula, I think maybe it's Iberian. I don't know. I've always thought it was Iberian because I had a Spanish teacher in high school that would say Iberia. And Iberia might be kind of an Americanized thing, but I don't know. I don't really know how it's pronounced. But Pandemic Iberia sounds better to me. It's a historical game of Pandemic. No flying around the board. It's pre-manned flight. You instead are building railroad tracks. You can take ferries around. You have things where people will overrun hospitals, which doesn't really happen now. Maybe not to the point of where it's a good mechanism in a game. Great mechanism in Pandemic Iberia. Artistically, the artwork here goes so well with the game too. These nice backgrounds to cards. And I'm not an expert in that time period, but I felt like when I was playing the game, I was playing it just with a realistic implementation of rules that fit the theme. It's my number 2 Pandemic implementation of all time. Leaves number 1, which I've already teased, Pandemic Legacy Season 1. If you haven't played a Legacy game, let me just quickly explain that. A Legacy game is a game where you play it and you make decisions that permanently impact either the board state or the characters you're playing. And then you play again, and it's a continuation. Maybe it's a new game, but there's an overarching narrative or there's an overarching causal chain going on here. We'll complain about Legacy games because usually we'll play them and then you're done with the campaign. A lot of games now will make it so you can keep playing afterwards, but it's not really what the Legacy game is about. My opinion, it's just the best way to make sure you play the game that many times. Most board games that I played, I do not play 12 times, and if you buy Pandemic Legacy Season 1, you're almost guaranteed, if you can get past game 1, you're going to play it at least 12 times, probably more, because the way this particular Legacy game works is when you lose, you get a chance to play again for that chapter of the campaign. If you pardon my burping here, I'm actually getting over a cold. I'm actually pretty happy with my ability to avoid blowing my nose here, although my youngest has it, and that's why he woke up on the monitor. Yeah, Pandemic Legacy Season 1, it's my favorite experience playing any game ever. Even above video games like Skyrim or The Witcher, where I really like the campaign-style games like that, or movies or shows I followed. If you say, what do you want to do? You want to play Pandemic Legacy? Or do you want to... Unless there's someone that I know just doesn't like board games, I'm going to recommend Pandemic Legacy. This is one of the best implementations of just hobby media that, in my opinion, has ever been released. I hope you enjoyed the top 10 Pandemic implementations of all time. I'm Jackson Warfield. This is Jackson Warfield's Game Room. Till next time.